All right, let's get this show on the road. A few more people wandering in. Good morning. My name is Mark Erikson, and today I am very excited to be talking to you about maintaining a library and a community. Uh, I did this talk last year at another conference, and I only had about 20 minutes. And here they gave me an entire hour time slot. I have plenty more stories to share, and I get to go into those stories in more detail. So this should be fun. A few things about myself. I am a senior engineer at Replay, where we are building a time-traveling debugger for JavaScript. We're also trying to research ways to make AI programming tools smarter by giving them access to actual data about what happened at runtime in the recorded applications. Very cool, very powerful. Please check it out if you get a chance. I am an answer of questions. I will pop up pretty much anywhere there is a text box on the internet and answer questions primarily about React and Redux and JavaScript. I collect all kinds of useful and interesting links and then file them away for later and toss them out as answers for people. I am a writer of extremely long blog posts, things like articles about why Redux was designed in certain ways or how React rendering works. And I am a maintainer of the Redux JavaScript library for state management. I've written most of our tutorials at this point, touched most of the docs. I worked on React Redux, Redux Toolkit. But most people tend to know me as that guy with the Simpsons avatar. I made that several years back, started using it, and it has basically become a symbol at this point. So, what are we trying to do today? I have a few different goals. I realize there's some different people in the audience. One, especially for people who don't work on any kind of open source library themselves, is I would like to try to clarify, what do open source maintainers even do? I want to try to give some examples of what it's like to be a maintainer, and especially for those people who do work on maintaining some kind of a project, I'd like to try to offer some suggestions and lessons to try to help you succeed. So why am I even talking about any of this? So I have been the primary maintainer of the Redux family of JavaScript libraries since about the middle of 2016. And for context, Redux is one of the larger libraries in the React web dev ecosystem. Back in like 2017 at its peak, probably about 60% of React applications used Redux. And although that percentage has dwindled over time, and today I'd say it's probably 35% of apps use Redux. In terms of absolute downloads, total number of users, Redux is still one of the most widely used tools in the React ecosystem. In fact, I can pretty much guarantee that every single person in this room has used applications that have my code inside, like, say, Twitter or Slack. So you have benefited from the work that I've done. So I have a fair amount of practical experience in maintaining a pretty popular open source project. Now, a lot of the stories that we're going to go through today are very personal experience, but I think that most of the things that I've experienced are pretty universal to people who have done open source. So what is a maintainer anyway? If we think about programmers, I think one of the stereotypes that comes to mind is a programmer is a machine that turns coffee into code. You're late at night hacking on code, huddled up in a corner somewhere, or these days sitting at home working remotely. But when we think about maintainers, I feel like the common stereotype is that a maintainer is kind of like a vending machine. File issue or bug report, get fixed. Like the new version just sort of magically happens, right? But it's actually a lot more complicated than that. When we think about open source, there's this kind of strange dichotomy between what the legal aspects of it are versus the community and practices that we've built around it. If you look at an open source license like MIT or Apache or GPL, it basically boils down to, here's some code, I've made it publicly available, anybody can use this if you want to, please cite where it came from, but there are no further obligations on me. If it breaks, that's your problem. not mine. But in practice, when we talk about open source, we are really there's this expectation that when you put code online, you are not just making it available, but you are going to back it, maintain it, support it, answer questions, fix bugs. And it's wonderful. This has supported the modern ecosystem. But in a lot of ways, what this also means is that people who use open source tend to look at it as a black box, even though the code's available and anybody can fork it or file a PR or try to improve it. In practice, it's almost like it's proprietary. There's this expectation that only the maintainers are capable of actually working on that code. There was a very good book by Nadia Eghbal a few years ago called Working in Public: The Making and Maintenance of Open Source. Excellent book, highly recommended. One of the points she made was she had studied hundreds of different open source projects and grouped them into the classic 2x2 grid based on number of contributors and number of people using that project. And so if you go through the different categories, there are projects with lots of contributors and lots of users. Rust has a very broad ecosystem of contributors working on various libraries, the tooling, the documentation, and obviously a lot of people using Rust as well. There are tools like AstroPi, where the people who are interested in building it are fairly high, but overall it's a niche tool that only a certain number of people would be interested in using. Anyway, there are projects like Babel where basically everybody in an entire ecosystem uses it, but there's only a handful of maintainers. And I think a lot of the open source projects that we have today fall into that category, including Redux. And then finally, there's the toys where it's, one person is working on something and they've pushed it up and technically the code's out there, but nobody will ever look at it. So a lot of the, my own personal experience, and I think a lot of the things I'm going to talk about are probably focused more on kind of that stadium category, but I think it's probably one of the biggest categories of open source projects out there. So we all know that there's an XKCD comic for everything, and one of the classics is this comic about dependencies. The modern world, we have layers upon layers of dependencies, and when you get down to it, one of the most important dependencies is some tiny little thing that's been quietly maintained by one person, often a quarter, for years, and that's great up until that person stops maintaining it or something breaks. Artem Zakharchenko, who maintains the MSW network mocking library for JavaScript, said that maintaining an open source project means being a developer, manager, designer, dev advocate, tech support, salesperson, community manager, content creator, technical writer, and a human being all at the same time. That is a lot of different hats to be wearing. And that's really what being an open source maintainer is. So let's look at some of the different roles and aspects and things that a maintainer actually spends their time doing. Like I said, in one sense, open source is just putting code online, slapping a license on it, and saying it's here if anybody cares about it. But in practice, if I've put a project online, I would probably like people to use my project, which means that I actually need to spend time trying to advertise it, discuss it, do demos or examples or something. A few years ago, I was looking for a new job, and I had been, for the last 2 or 3 years, doing a team lead position, which was about 50% of my time spent in meetings, and 50% still actually trying to write code. And I was tired of the meetings and ready to go back to just writing code. And so I was just looking for a full-time individual contributor position. And somewhere in the middle of that process, somebody sent me a job offer or a job listing or something that was for a developer relations position. And I remember pasting that description into a chat channel with some friends and saying, I want to be a full-time programmer. Why in the world would they send me a devrel listing? And someone replied, Mark, what have you been doing for Redux for the last several years? And I went, oh. Like, if you think about it, a devrel is making technical content to explain how the tool works, and doing public speaking, and engaging with the community, and advocating for user needs. This is all a lot of overlap with being an open source maintainer. So one of the biggest things that we maintainers do is provide support for our community. And it's probably one of the most valuable things that you can do for your users. Every project's going to handle this differently. For Redux, the primary venue, of course, is the GitHub Issues tab. We have tried to more or less organize it so that the Issues section is just for actual bugs or feature requests. If it's more of a how do I use this kind of a question, we try to redirect that to the discussion section. Admittedly, we probably also don't pay as much attention to things in the discussion section as we do in issues, but also the number of open issues is like a mental concern. And so trying to minimize the number of open issues actually kind of matters to us a bit. We do have a channel in the ReactiveFlux Discord, and so we see a pretty good number of questions show up there. And of course, like live chat is easier to answer some things as well. I naturally spend entirely too much time on social media. I don't use bots. I just obsessively refresh Reddit and Twitter and Hacker News and Blue Sky and everything else. And so I have developed a reputation over the years that anytime someone mentions Redux, I will show up and end up answering that question. And without actually intending to, this has gotten me a pretty good reputation. I've had people who don't even use Redux thank me for the amount of time that I actually spend answering questions. David Khorshid, who built the XState state machine library, the running joke is that if you say the word state machine 3 times in a thread, David will pop up and say hi. And so, like, being active and spending time answering questions and looking for these discussions is actually a very valuable service that you can provide for your community. So for myself, I don't have strict rules, but kind of like as a natural default, I try to respond to new issues pretty rapidly. I spend entirely too much time refreshing the GitHub notifications page, which means that anytime there is a new issue or a comment, I will probably see it pretty quickly. And so I try to make a point to at least put in an initial response right away, even if that response is, I have no idea what you're asking for. Could you please provide more details? It is, of course, very important to try to get a reproduction for an actual problem that somebody's having, either because it could be a mistake on their side, and as they try to provide the reproduction, they realize, oops, that was my fault, not the library's. As well as, like, if they're describing something that's happening in their large corporate application, I have no way to actually inspect that or fix it myself. And so if they can take the time to provide a repro, then there's at least a chance that I could look at it and see what's going on. And so even if I don't have an actual solution or answer for them right away, at least I've been able to respond. They know that someone's listening, they feel heard, and then we can continue the discussion from there. So I do my best to be patient and courteous, but it's also true that users don't have rights to my time and energy. When someone starts getting demanding, or they insist that we fix things, or they don't like an answer, that's their problem, not mine. Another one of the ways that we communicate with our users is, of course, documentation. And in a lot of ways, documentation is even more important than code. Like, if it's not documented, does it even exist? I am not a trained technical writer, but I've spent a lot of time writing docs over the years. I've done some reading and research on good ways to write documentation. So I've got practical experience and learned some things over the years. I particularly like the 4 categories model of documentation, also known as Divio or diataxis. It's not perfect, but it is a pretty good starting point. And it suggests that you should try to organize your documentation into 4 different categories. Tutorials teach users what a thing is and how to use it. How-to guides cover specific topics and answer certain questions. Explanations go into more details, and then references are your classical, here's the list of all the methods and all the options. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good starting point. And if you're trying to write documentation, it's a good way to think about organizing the information. And in a lot of cases, it's good to have the same info in multiple different places. Someone might be trying to learn a library for the first time and going through the tutorial, or someone might know how to use it already and they're trying to answer a certain question, and they wouldn't look at the tutorial. But if you have that answer in a how-to page or an API reference, then different people coming into different pages might be able to find the answer in different ways. There are a lot of other forms of documentation as well. The README, which is in the repo or published on NPM or Cargo, change logs, release notes, FAQs, all qualify as different forms of documentation. One important thing when you're writing documentation is to keep in mind, who do I expect to be reading this? What is their expected experience level? What are the prerequisites that I expect them to know already versus what do I need to explain from scratch? When I rewrote the Redux tutorials a few years ago, I actually had a paragraph up front that said, I expect you already know JavaScript, TypeScript, HTML, CSS, and most of the basics of React, so that I don't have to spend time in the Redux tutorial explaining how to write JavaScript or React. The classic, if you go too far back, now you're explaining physics and silicon and starting from scratch in order to teach a programming language. I would say that there's no such thing as too much documentation. We have had some users complain that there are too many different pages in the Redux docs. I can understand that point, but I would rather have more pages that overcover things than not enough material and not having a thing be covered. So what about the actual coding behavior? If I'm a library maintainer and I'm trying to design some new feature or an API, every API that I build is an attempt to actually solve something or some problem that my users have. And so I have in mind, here's what they want to accomplish. Here's roughly what this thing needs to do or how it needs to behave. And then that guides both the public API design and the internal behavior. And there's what I have in mind as I'm designing it, and then there's kind of how things work out in reality. If I'm designing an API, it needs to be flexible enough to handle the exact specific thing that they're trying to do, and also possibly some additional patterns that we haven't quite thought of yet. So maybe you're designing some options, or you provide some callbacks so the user can customize behavior. But inevitably, no matter how much time and effort you put into designing an API, people will end up trying to use it in ways that you never, ever actually anticipated. There is a quote called Hiram's Law, named after an engineer from Google, which loosely says that every behavior, whether or not you documented it, will be depended on by somebody. As an example of this, so the React Redux library, up through version 5, all the React components had direct subscriptions to the store, and so they could always see the latest state. And if you were doing a server-side rendering pattern and then trying to lazy load a component and add it to the tree later, initially people kind of hacked around this by inserting new reducer logic in a class component constructor, because the component constructor would run before the map state to props function would try to read that from the Redux store. So they could guarantee that the new data is available before your component tries to access it. Everything works great. When we put out React Redux version 6 in late 2018, which ended up being a mistake, bad architecture, my fault, we were trying to get ahead of where the React team was going with concurrent rendering. And they warned us about this concept of tearing. If half of the React tree renders with some existing data, and then like React pauses halfway through, and then Redux gets some new data, and then React renders the other half of the tree. Now different components rendered with different data, and your tree is out of sync, and this is like the worst possible thing ever. And so I was trying to get ahead of that possible problem before React released some of these updates. And so I changed React Redux's behavior to grab the latest state at the top of the component tree before it would start rendering and consistently use the same state value through the entire tree during that render pass. And this would fix and avoid the tearing problem. Unfortunately, it also turned out that that meant that if someone were to inject a new reducer halfway down the tree, their component wouldn't see the new data because it was still working off the existing state, and something cannot access value of undefined because the data wasn't there. We never documented the expected behavior or timing of when things would be added, but people depended on that specific behavior. And so these are the kinds of things that you kind of have to watch out for as you're designing these APIs. So some guidelines as you're trying to design something. What is the problem that your users are even trying to accomplish? Can this be accomplished in user space? Like, can the user themselves just write some code and solve it? Do I actually need to add a new feature to my library to make this possible? How many users actually need this? Like, if it's just one or two very loud people, maybe it's not worth the time and effort to actually build it. Is it outside the scope of the library? Like, if we just keep adding features endlessly, then like it's just going to keep growing. How am I actually expecting my users to use this feature? What's the intended usage pattern look like? How does this integrate with the rest of our APIs? Are the API design patterns consistent? Does this one kind of look weird or awkward next to the others? If you're using JavaScript or TypeScript, what does the expected type definition patterns look like? And really, how hard is this going to be for us to build or maintain? Like, yeah, we can ship it, but are we going to spend lots and lots of time dealing with this? Every bit of code we add to the library is something we own pretty much permanently after that. So as much as we want to try to support user requests, not all features deserve to be added. Dominic Dorfmeister, who maintains the React Query and TanStack Query family libraries, had a great talk last year on React Query API design and lessons learned. Highly recommend that talk if you get a chance. So one of the great things about open source is that anybody can contribute. And contributions from actual users are great, but it does take time and effort from us as a maintainer to actually deal with this. We have to see what the issue or the PR is, take time to read through it, review the code, and then try to figure out, like, does this actually implement the intended behavior correctly? Does this fit in with the rest of the library? Does this need tests? Does it work right? And that all assumes it's even a legitimate attempt to contribute to the library. If you have a library and you're expecting contributions, having some sort of contributing guide with guidelines on clone the repo, add here, fork, feature branch, tests, etc., can be useful. Generally, the more effort that you put into filing a PR in terms of documentation and tests, the easier it is for me in my limited amount of time to try to look at it, understand what's going on, and actually land it. If you just file a PR and it's a big blob of code, I'm probably going to end up ignoring it because I don't have the brain space to look at it. So there's really a balance of factors. Admittedly, when I see someone file a PR, I feel a bit of sense of obligation because I know they put time and effort into it, and I don't want to just reject it. No, I don't care. But then there's also the question of, is this actually worth adding? And even how much time and effort is it going to take me to kind of help guide this person through making some remaining changes versus do I just get it done myself? One of the best examples of this was back in late 2016. I had only just started maintaining Redux a couple months earlier, and a random user showed up and said, I've basically rewritten all of React Redux from scratch, and I think it's a lot faster. Would you like this? And of course, I kind of laughed. Right. Yeah. And I knew just enough about Redux's internals at the time to start asking, have you thought about this edge case or this situation or this option? And to my surprise, the user actually kept saying no, but let me go tweak this and work on it. And I eventually took a look at some of the benchmarks, and it was actually faster. And eventually, once I realized they were serious about this, then I took on the role of shepherding and pushing them through getting the rest of that work done. And we did ship that. That was React Redux version 5, which we shipped in late 2016. And that was what everyone used for the next 2 to 3 years. Unfortunately, along with legitimate contributions, there is also spam, which shows up in many different forms, from the ever popular "me too" or "any updates" comments on issues, Hacktoberfest PRs just to add themselves to the list of contributors in a repo. These days, there's a lot of AI-generated PRs. The curl project gets a lot of very bogus vulnerability reports. Or even worse, there are intentional attacks, like the one that almost got the xzutils tool a couple years back. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of good answers for this. You can always auto-lock old issues to try to cut down on how often someone comments on them. But if it's a new issue or PR, then we actually have to spend time looking at it and try to figure out, like, is this real? Is this a person? Is this legit? Is this even worth me paying any attention to? And in the case of the xzutils attack, they actually used a bunch of fake social pressure from different accounts on a mailing list to complain about how the original maintainer wasn't responding fast enough and pressured them to accept a PR that had malicious code inside. And so, like, even these social factors can be an issue. Package versioning. Version numbers are both a code contract and a tool for managing user expectations. I think most of us are familiar with semantic versioning, where you've got a major version, a minor version, and a patch. And so if I look at a patch release, it's probably just a small tweak or bug fix. If it's a minor, then it's probably got some new features. And if it's a major version, then there's the implication that this could break something. This is really simple, and absolutely nothing could go wrong with this idea, right? Well, what about pre-release versions? You've got to test things out. You got to push an alpha or beta. You're hoping some of your users are actually going to try this out, except that in practice, you get like 2 replies, and then you finally publish the live version, and then everybody tries it out and tells you all the things that actually break. What about a bug fix that changes behavior? What about changing behavior that's not part of your public API, but it turns out someone was depending on this? What about changes to TypeScript types? Does that apply to semantic versioning? How often are you supposed to publish a major version anyway? Should I publish new features in minors? Should I hold them for majors? Really, is a major version more about breaking changes, or is it kind of more like a marketing event? I'd never thought about any of this stuff before I started having to deal with this. I actually just saw a great blog post literally yesterday from Simon Willison, where he said that if your library doesn't have any documentation, it can't have bugs, because bugs are going against documented behavior. So clearly the answer is no documentation, right? But there was also a really good discussion on Blue Sky a couple months ago about, like, what is a breaking change anyway? And again, like, you would think that this has a definitive answer, but no, there's a lot of fuzziness and flexibility here. Questions like, was the behavior documented? Was the API publicly exposed? What did we intend the behavior to be in the first place? Is this actually going to cause a build error? How many people actually care about this? All these different things. Again, there's an XKCD for everything. Hiram's law in action, the classic XKCD where they fixed the spacebar overheating the CPU and someone complains that was a key part of their workflow. Everything can be a breaking change to somebody somewhere. So what that means is that, frankly, versioning can be kind of arbitrary at times. So how do we manage breaking changes? How often should we publish changes that actually break user code? According to semantic versioning, it's just if you publish a breaking change, you're supposed to bump the major version, so I can do that as often as I want, right? In practice, a breaking change is going to cost our users time and effort, and sometimes that's justified. But it also means that I need to take into account, like, how much suffering am I going to inflict on my users by publishing this new version? And so, like, how many users will it affect? How easy is it for the users to fix this? Is this change actually justified, or could we kind of live with it, even though it's not ideal? So for me personally, I try to minimize how much actual true code breakage there is, even in a major version. So basically it amounts to you spend a lot of time thinking about this, you try to batch up breaking changes into one major version and then kind of get them done all at once. You do your best to document things. And if you can provide some kind of a code mod that would automatically rewrite the user's code to match the new patterns, that can help simplify things. Okay, we are halfway through. Good. I could probably get through the rest of my slides. Along with that, with the changes in terms of the actual code itself, you also have to think about the compatibility impact of just shipping a new version that has a new major associated with it. At least in the NPM ecosystem, package managers default to installing the latest major unless you specify otherwise. And that means that just publishing a new major can cause things to break because of expected version incompatibilities. I have multiple examples of this. One that I was actually involved in a way. React had been on version 18 for about 2.5 years. There were complaints that they weren't shipping the new features fast enough. And React 19 came out in December. Now, for years, the most common way to start up a new application was a command line tool called Create React App, originally from Facebook itself. And it had kind of gone unmaintained about 2.5, almost 3 years ago. So there were other better tools and ways to create React projects, but there were still a lot of tutorials and articles that said, let's start by running Create React App, my app, and it'll do it. So it was still being fairly widely used. And in January, I started seeing a lot of people post on Reddit and various repos that I tried to run Create React App, and I'm getting this massive error. And most of the people running into this were beginners who didn't know much of anything about React or Node or NPM or anything else. The problem was that the templates that Create React App used specified certain tools for things like tests and linting. Those tools had expected peer dependencies for React 18. The NPM package manager is very strict about peer dependencies, and if there's a mismatch, it will throw an error rather than saying, well, I hope you know what you're doing, and installing the package anyway. And so the minute React 18 came out, or 19 came out, someone would try to create a project. It would start with the listed packages in the template. It would try to install the latest version of React and then promptly error because they were mismatched. Nobody owned the Create React App project at this point, and so it was broken and nobody was fixing it. I ended up yelling loudly, repeatedly, and finally got the attention of the React team, and they ended up fixing it and formally deprecating Create React App, as well as actually fixing the templates so it at least works, but also now tells people you shouldn't be using this tool anymore. But like it was something that not only did nobody test this, there was no one who owned Create React App to even think about this. And so just the act of publishing a new major version broke a tool, and no one expected that to happen. The Zod validator tool just announced version 4, but they're not even publishing it as a major version because lots of other tools and libraries in the ecosystem directly depend on version 3. And so the author of Zod wrote and put up an issue where he said, if I just publish a new major, it's going to have massive ripple effects on the entire ecosystem. So I'm actually going to publish version 4 as a nested entry point in the version 3 package. And we're going to wait a few years for the ecosystem to transition before I can finally try to do this. I spent all of 2023 working on Redux Toolkit 2.0, which tried to update our packaging setup. And it turned out I actually had to ship major versions of all of our related packages simultaneously. And then even just a day or two ago, ESLint published a retrospective on the release of version 9, where they said, we put up the initial RFC like 5 years ago. We put, like lots of work into documenting and announcing that this was going to happen. But it turns out most people don't want to read the change logs. They just want their configs to work. We changed some other things that we didn't expect to be a problem, but were a problem. And so, the release of version 9 ended up causing a lot of pain for the ecosystem. And so all that to say that while you can just publish a major, it has a lot of very practical implications for how the rest of the ecosystem is going to behave. And then there's TypeScript. So the TypeScript compiler itself does not follow semantic versioning. It's almost more of a decimal versioning, 5.8, 5.9, 6.0. And realistically speaking, any version of the TypeScript compiler could break working code. I have personal experience with this. I also work on the reselect library for reading data from a Redux store. And I had written an exceptionally complicated TypeScript type that was very complex and very fragile. And while they were working on, I think, TS 4.9, they filed a PR. They ran a bunch of automated tests against libraries in the ecosystem. One type in one library broke, and it was the type that I'd written for reselect. So they pinged me, and I tried to explain what I was trying to do in the first place. They ended up providing an alternative. Although that only worked starting from version 4.7, and we still wanted to support back to version 4.1, so I had to do complicated build system things to say, if you're running TypeScript 4.1 through 4.6, you get the old type definition. If it's 4.7 or above, you get the new type definition. It gets pretty hard sometimes. So then there's also the question of what versions of TypeScript do I expect our types to work with? The definitely typed repository basically says the last 2 years of versions. We've tried to match that ourselves recently. But if I change our matrix of which TS versions we officially support, does that count as a breaking change, or can I do that in a minor version? We go with minors. Your mileage may vary. And so then there's even the question of for the actual types themselves, what counts as semantic versioning? What's a breaking change? Chris Kryko did a lot of work to try to define what semver means for TypeScript types. Excellent document there. So when you actually do put out a release, having roadmaps, release notes, change logs are very, very important. Telling people what changed, why, the context, the impacts. I know that a lot of people are fans of things like the conventional commit pattern where you prefix every commit message with is this a feature? Is it a bug fix? Is this breaking? Whatever. I personally am not a fan. One, because I don't want to think about it while I'm trying to write the code, but then also I want to be able to go back when I'm doing the release, look at the PRs, and actually write up descriptions myself of all the changes and what they mean in context. I will say that it's very nice that when you do a release, GitHub will auto-insert a list of all the PRs that were merged since the last release, so at least I don't have to assemble that one myself. So if you have the joy of working in the JavaScript NPM ecosystem, publishing packages is still very much the Wild West. None of us know what we're doing. We're all making it up as we go. We're all borrowing things from each other. And unfortunately, dealing with the ESM CommonJS module switchover is still an utter nightmare. Before I started working on this in 2023, I had accumulated hundreds of bookmarks about various approaches. I knew it was going to be hard, and it was still worse than I thought it was going to be. I wrote a blog post halfway through 2023 complaining about all the stuff I'd tried and all the different things that had broken. We eventually landed on some working patterns, and then we still ended up having to fix more things later on. The problem is there's all these different tools. There's runtimes and package managers and build tools, and they're all looking for different fields in your package JSON file, and they all end up interpreting things a little bit differently, and none of this is documented anywhere. So you basically get something that you think works, you publish it, and then someone else complains that it doesn't run with this other tool that you've never tried before. It is a royal pain. The good news is that I think they've added the ability in Node to import ESM modules directly into common JS files and just have it work. And they backported that as far as Node 20. And I think now that Node 18 is end of life, in theory, all the major versions of Node that are out have support for this. At some point, we will be able to say, you know what, we just assume this works and stop shipping common JS files, but that day is not today. So there's various ways you can handle this. There are a lot of folks who are already only shipping ESM modules for simplicity. I understand why people have done that. I would consider myself a compatibility maximalist. I want my library to just work in as many environments as possible without the end user having to think about it. That does mean that I've taken on a lot of the pain and suffering myself to try to make that work. And one of the things that's helped us is literally having CI jobs that just take the PR version of our library and build it with a whole bunch of different packaging tools just to see if it still works correctly or if we just managed to break things. So, some practical real-world examples. In, what was it? Early 22, I think. So Redux came out in 2015. Redux Toolkit, the modern way to write Redux code, came out in late 2019. I rewrote our tutorials in 2020 to teach that as a default. But the problem is that there's still tons and tons of boot camps and YouTube tutorials and Medium posts that were still teaching the outdated original patterns. And we can't do anything to convince these people to change things. The content's up there. So early 22, I thought about it. I'm like, you know what? The only way I have to communicate to people is via what we publish in the library itself. And really, beginners don't read documentation for a whole bunch of reasons. So even though we've said use Redux Toolkit in our docs, the people who need to read this aren't going to. So the idea that I had was that I would publish a new version of the Redux core library that just added the deprecated doc attribute to the main create store method. And the idea is that if someone's following a boot camp or tutorial and they're in their editor and they import create store, it'll just have a strike through it. Now, there's no errors, nothing's going to break. It's got a strike through. And so hopefully they would hover over it and ask, why does this have a strike through? And then it would show the documentation tooltip, which says you shouldn't use this anymore. You should use Redux Toolkit instead. And so we're not breaking anything. There's no runtime changes. And ultimately users have the option between ignoring it because it doesn't break anything, or updating to Redux Toolkit, which is what we want. Or I even exported an aliased version, legacy_create store, that just doesn't have the deprecated attribute. Simple. I'm not breaking anything. And so I shipped this in Redux 4.2.0, a minor version, and I copiously documented what was changing and why. The release notes clearly explained what we were doing. There's even a screenshot showing what's going on. In fact, notice the bold words. I am not going to remove the create store API. I don't know how much clearer I can be about this. And people started yelling at us. Reddit, Twitter, GitHub. There was the first person who posted a Stack Overflow issue asking what this message meant. I replied, The comments under my answer continued for months with people complaining that I had dared to make a change, or like actually complaining that if you added the word deprecated, that has to mean you're going to remove it, right? Like, no, like the literal definition of deprecated just means this is outdated and there's a better way to do it. How many times do I have to explain this? Honestly, it was infuriating. It was one of the most frustrating episodes I've ever had as a maintainer. So when it came time to publish the new version of the Redux core in 2023, by rights, I could have removed create store. It's a semver major. I can do whatever I want, right? Breaking changes. But I didn't want to break working code, whether it be an existing application or someone following a tutorial. So I left the create store method in there with the deprecated tag because I wanted to keep things working. Ironically, we then changed the publishing format for the Redux Thunk package, and it did kind of break things, but oh well. Another example, I spent all of 2023 working on Redux Toolkit 2.0. And this was primarily about updating the packaging to better support both ESM and CommonJS compatibility, dropping legacy support, ES5, IE11, all that good stuff. And we did have a few new features we wanted to ship. As I mentioned earlier, proper ESM CommonJS compatibility is stupidly hard. And along the way, I realized that I really needed to ship major versions for all of our libraries because I had to do the same packaging changes for all of them. But there was another problem. At the time, we had probably at least 150 open issues related to the RTK query data fetching piece in Redux Toolkit. And like we'd gone along 4 years of 1.x. It was finally time for a 2.0. And I really didn't know how long it might be before we might ship another major version after this. But I also didn't know which of those RTK query issues might require breaking changes. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, I'm going to have to spend all this, like even after I figure out the packaging, I'm going to have to spend all this time going through the issues, analyzing them, trying to figure out which of them might be breaking, and we might have to do the development work on some of these RTK query features just to get them into 2.0, because that's when we're doing the breaking changes. It's already been like 8 or 9 months. This is going to like delay it like an entire another year. And frankly, it was intimidating. It was like there was like this giant weight on me because of how long it looked like this was going to take. So late 23, we finally managed to figure out a seemingly mostly working packaging setup. But really the key thing here was I put on my project manager hat and I had an idea and I messaged the other maintainers and I was like, what if we just don't touch RTK query for this release? Like we're just going to defer all that work until after 2.0 is out the door. They agreed, and I could feel the weight come off my shoulders because now it was a finite list of like 10 or 15 tasks left to do to actually complete 2.0. Part of that was saying that, hey, later on, if I'm looking at some of these RTK query issues and that requires a breaking change, we'll do a 3.0 if that's needed. We did ship a number of code mods for some of the syntax changes, and we also shipped a very large migration guide trying to detail everything that changed and why and a lot of the impacts. So we shipped that in December of 2023. I either made the brilliant decision or the mistake to ship this literally on a Monday morning right before I went to the airport for an international trip. And as I was driving to the airport, one of the other maintainers messaged me and said, I think you just broke React Native. And I had, because now we were pre-bundling the React Redux artifacts, but we had previously been relying on the React Native bundler finding certain alternative individual files on disk, and those no longer existed. Naturally, React Native was the one thing we didn't have an example app for in our CI jobs, of course. So I ended up having to try to reproduce this at the gate at the airport, push to fix at the next gate at the next airport, and then publish the release right after I sat down on the plane. That was fun. Overall, the 2.0 release actually went fairly well. But of course, the packaging setup that we landed on still had some issues. People reported that the lesser known JSPM package manager didn't work right because it doesn't want a process env node env value to be in the bundles. It expects something that works in the browser. So we made a tentative change that was supposed to fix that. Meanwhile, recently, the React Native Metro bundler made some changes to try to better support package exports. And one of my other maintainers tweaked the package setup to try to handle that, except then when we shipped it as 2.8 just a couple months ago, people began to report that now their jest tests were failing because it was finding a different file, something, ESM compatibility. We went back and forth on how to handle it. Part of me was like, that's Jest's problem and not ours. But Jest environment JS DOM is what people tend to use by default, so that would actually break a lot of people. We did manage to tweak the packaging again to get that to work. Like it's ridiculous the number of things we've had to do to get that to cooperate. All right, we will actually manage to finish on time. Cool, hopefully. So, I've said earlier that there's a lot of stuff going on. You know, we wear a lot of different hats. We're dealing with a constant stream of issues. And the problem is that as wonderful as open source actually is and how key it is for the world's infrastructure, the patterns in the community that we've built up around it are frankly painful and troublesome and a recipe for maintainer burnout. You know, users will constantly file issues, and most of them are this broke, or add this feature, or why haven't you shipped this bug fix yet? For some reason, there's very few issues saying everything works great, thank you, I'm happy. And people expect fixes right away. In the worst case, you have large companies saying, hey, this is broken, but they're not even giving back or providing any support themselves to fix it. And so we maintainers see this constant flood of negativity and complaints, and it really wears you down a lot. And that's without even touching things that are outside the scope of this talk. Like, okay, yes, I've put this code out there for free, but is there like a legal or like a moral or ethical obligation for multi-billion-dollar companies to be paying us for our time, you know, regardless of that? Like, that's not even touching that one. So this is really a never-ending treadmill of negativity and obligation. And at least for myself, I know that my mental to-do list of things that I would like to do around the Redux libraries grows infinitely. There's stuff that dates back 2019 and earlier that I've just never had time to get around to doing. Now, remember, the open source licenses say, I've put this code out there. If it breaks, it's your fault. It's not my problem, no obligation. And users have the ability to fork that code. They could always fix it themselves, file a PR, patch the package, whatever. But even beyond that, again, speaking for myself, but I think this is true for a lot of us, we self-impose responsibility. When I first started applying the word maintainer to myself in 2016, I started to realize like I am taking on the role of providing support for all the users of Redux. That is a big responsibility. Like I said, like millions of developers, hundreds of millions of people using apps with my code. That is a serious responsibility, and I don't take it lightly. But it also means that I'm the one putting the obligation and the need to do these things on myself. I'm fortunate enough to have a day job where I can do open source work in my free time. I prefer it that way because if there was money involved in this, I would feel even more obligation than I already do. But I'm the one putting so much pressure on myself to try to be, the support. And it is really hard to keep up with all this. And so this can form a very toxic combination that directly leads to overload and burnout. I came very close to burning out in the spring of 2018. I had signed myself up to do a workshop, and for some reason I was doing an email newsletter because everyone was doing email newsletters and like all these different things. And I had always assumed that burnout was a thing that happens to other people, not me. And after a few months of being incredibly busy, I finally had a chance to step back and relax. And a few weeks later, I wanted to try to do some Redux work, and I had no energy to do it. I was like, that's not normal. Something's wrong here. And I had to look at all the different things I was doing, and I had to make some hard decisions about what I was going to spend my time on. The biggest one was I was continually updating some links lists of articles about React and Redux and the JavaScript ecosystem. I naturally read a lot of articles anyway, so I would filter them and categorize them and post them. But I would spend like a dozen hours every weekend doing this, and yet the backlog of articles to categorize kept growing. Very much a never-ending treadmill. And I knew that people were getting values out of this. The repos were like 25,000 stars. But again, I was the one feeling the need that I have to keep doing this. And I finally had to look at it and say, I want to still keep doing actual library maintenance. The only way I can manage it is if I stop doing some of these other things so that I still have the time and energy left to do the important pieces that I want to work on. So I basically haven't touched those lists since like 2018. So as maintainers, it is very important that we try to set boundaries and expectations to preserve our mental health. There's been some very good articles from other maintainers in different ecosystems, Vue, Python, Ansible, Homebrew, all basically saying roughly the same thing. Like, it is hard, and you have to be the one to say, I'm limiting how much time and effort I'm putting in here, and I have the right to say no if someone asks for a feature or asks me to do something. I want to support our users. Like, I'm not going to say that, seeing another issue filed is like a thing that brings me great joy, but because I've taken on this role and responsibility, I want to make sure things work well. And so I want to spend that time, but frankly, my time and mental capacity are very, very limited. I have a day job. I do this in my free time. And that massive list of issues is like a constant weight on my brain. It doesn't go away. And so I've had to come to terms with it and realize that, like, I will never empty that list. We will never hit inbox 0 on the list of things to do. And I've learned that I have to kind of like pick and choose 1 or 2 things at a time and just focus on them and chip away. When I rewrote our tutorial in last year, I spent about 75 focused hours of work on it. And hey, that's only 2 weeks, but it was spread over almost 6 months. Some of that was on flights because, like, hey, I've got like 2 to 3 hours of focus time, and like just chipping away at it bit by bit. So I have to be the one to very intentionally balance and prioritize my own mental health and time so that I can keep doing these things to support the rest of our community. So we are right on time. Wonderful. Takeaways. There is no manual for being a maintainer. Yeah, there's writings and articles and in lessons like this one, but when you start being a maintainer, no one hands you an official manual and says, here's how you do it, have fun. It easily can be a full-time job. I would not want to be paid to maintain Redux. I like being able to do it in my free time as much or a little as I want to when I have the energy. But it requires wearing a lot of different hats, and we have to be the ones to put up the boundaries. Really, most of the job is about dealing with people. Yeah, we spend time, building features and fixing bugs, but most of it is communicating with our users in some way. It can be very draining and stressful. That entire create store saga was driving me nuts. But the flip side is that when I go to conferences and I get to talk to people in person who are using Redux and they're telling me, we've built our whole app around it, or I've built my career off of using it, and they say thank you, that is like the most fulfilling thing that I can imagine. And so ultimately, it's very rewarding to know that I've had a big impact on a lot of the dev ecosystem and people's careers. As always, I have links to a lot of different things. The slides are up on my blog already. I did an earlier version of the talk last year, but I've got the updated slides on there as well, blog.isquaredsoftware.com. So whether you just use open source libraries, or whether you actually spend time publishing open source or even working on packages inside a company. I hope this has been informative. I hope this has been useful. And I hope this gives you a little bit of sympathy for what it's like maintaining open source. Thank you.